I arrived at my mother's house on a gray morning when the sky hung low and swollen, as if even the weather understood the weight pressing on my chest. The old two-story home stood unchanged, yet hollowed somehow, like a body with the spirit gone. Grief has a way of draining color from familiar places, and as I stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards groaned beneath me, an old, weary complaint that echoed my own. Inside, the air felt dense, thick with the scent of lavender sachets my mother used to tuck into drawers, now faded into something ghostly. Dust floated in thin shafts of light, drifting lazily as if time itself had slowed in her absence. I found myself listening for her footsteps, soft, shuffling, always busy. But the house was silent. Too silent. My sister, Lorna, sat at the kitchen table when I entered, her posture stiff, her fingers wrapped around a mug she didn't drink from. Her eyes flicked up briefly, unreadable. Lorna had always been the composed one, the sister who faced tragedy with a stillness that bordered on cold. But today, something felt different, her calmness felt rehearsed, almost strategically placed. "You're late," she said, her voice smooth but edged. "I came as soon as I could." I tried to read her face, but she kept her gaze fixed on a point beyond me, as though looking at me might break whatever internal balance she'd constructed. We moved through the house together, sorting through the remnants of our mother's life, the photographs, the brittle letters she saved, the scarves she folded with precision. It should have been a shared morning, two daughters navigating a final duty. Instead, there was a quiet strain between us. A tension I couldn't name, but felt with every step. It was when we reached the bedroom that unease took hold of me. The room was dim, curtains drawn against a world that had moved on without her. My mother's dresser, usually immaculate, had certain drawers pulled slightly out, as if someone had rummaged through them and hastily pushed them back. I placed my hand on one and slid it open slowly. Her jewelry boxes, delicate rosewood and velvet-lined, were there, but something felt wrong. Skewed. Not in the order she kept them. "Did you go through these already?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Lorna paused. "We have a lot to get through. Maybe you're misremembering how she kept things." But I wasn't misremembering. My mother was meticulous, especially with the items she cared about. And then I saw it, the safe in the corner of the closet. Heavy, old, with a misaligned hinge that caused it to sit slightly crooked when closed. Except now, it was more crooked than usual. A fraction more open. Just enough for someone to slip inside and take what wasn't theirs. "Did you open the safe?" I asked. Lorna's jaw tightened. Why would I? The question didn't soothe me. Instead, it opened a hollow pit in my stomach, a sense that the house wasn't just mourning, it was warning. And somewhere deep inside, I already knew, something was very, very wrong. The jewelry box felt lighter the moment I lifted it. A small thing, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know its usual weight, but to me, it was as jarring as a scream in a silent room. My fingers hesitated on the brass clasp before I opened it, already bracing myself for what I knew, somehow, I would not find inside. When the lid creaked upward, a coldness seeped into me. Empty velvet. Hollow indentations where precious metal once rested. Spaces shaped like absence. My mother's wedding band, the one she polished every Sunday morning, gone. Her sapphire brooch, inherited from my grandmother, gone. The gold locket with our childhood photos, the one she wore even during her sickest days, gone. A chill crawled over my spine. "Lorna," I called out, my voice thinner than I intended. She appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, as though bracing for confrontation she had already prepared for. "What is it now? Where are her things?" I asked, barely managing the words. "Her jewelry. It's missing." Lorna stepped forward and glanced into the box. "Maybe she moved it before she passed," she said, her tone casual. Too casual. You know how she was near the end. Forgetful. Forgetful. The word stabbed at me. Our mother had faded physically, yes, but her mind had remained sharp almost to the last day. She remembered birthdays, recipes, even the name of the mailman she'd known for 20 years. Forgetfulness wasn't her way. "No," I said quietly. "She didn't misplace these." Lorna sighed in that weary way of hers, as if grief had become an inconvenience she was forced to carry. "Then maybe someone else came by. Hospice nurses. Friends. You never know." That's not possible, I said. She kept this box hidden in the safe. Her eyes flickered. A small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my pulse trip. I closed the jewelry box slowly, feeling nausea twist beneath my ribs. My mother's jewels were more than objects, they were the history of our family in metal and stone. I remembered sitting beside her at the dining table as a child, watching her polish each piece with gentle hands. She would tell stories, of the brooch gifted on her wedding day, the silver earrings she bought with her first paycheck, the bracelet my father gave her before deployment. These things carry memory, she had whispered to me once. And memory deserves protection. I felt her words now like a cold breath on my neck. Lorna turned away as if the conversation were over, but I followed her into the hallway. Did you go into the safe? I asked, my voice breaking despite my effort to keep it steady. No, she said without looking at me. And I'm getting tired of the accusations. They weren't accusations, not yet. They were questions. Desperate ones. But something in her tone, her posture, her refusal to meet my eyes tightened the dread coiling inside me. The shadows in the house seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if absorbing my fear. Someone had taken my mother's jewelry. And the terrible thought I was trying to resist began to take shape. What if that someone was standing right in front of me? I didn't confront Lorna again, not at first. Grief sharpened my instincts rather than dulled them, and something told me that if I pushed too hard, she would retreat deeper into whatever shadows she was hiding in. So I watched. Quietly. Methodically. The way my mother used to study a storm from the kitchen window, knowing she couldn't stop it, but wanting to understand its shape. The first clue arrived by accident. I was emptying a trash bag in the garage when a slip of paper drifted out, fluttering like an injured moth. I caught it before it touched the ground. At first, I didn't recognize what I was holding, thin thermal paper, slightly crumpled. But when the words sharpened in the dim light, my breath hitched. Golden West Pawnbrokers, item intake receipt date, 3 days after our mother's death. Seller, name L. Harper. Lorna. The list of items made my skin prickle, gold ring with inset pearl. Sapphire brooch. Vintage chain necklace. Pieces unmistakably hers, our mother's treasures. My throat closed, and for a moment, the edges of my vision blurred. I had expected suspicion. But not proof, not so soon, and not so brazenly discarded in a trash bin she knew I would clean. I folded the receipt carefully and tucked it into my pocket. I didn't intend to accuse her until I understood the full scope of what she'd done. Hours later, still unsteady, I drove to the pawn shop. The smell inside was metallic and tired, the air clogged with the scent of old electronics and broken promises. The clerk, a lanky man with a thinning ponytail, nodded when I placed the receipt on the counter. She was here, he said, tapping the paper. Looked nervous. Said the jewelry wasn't sentimental. He shrugged. We get stories all the time. Can I see the footage? I asked. He hesitated only a moment before turning a monitor toward me. The grainy footage showed Lorna, her face drawn tight with determination, sliding the velvet-lined case across the counter. She avoided eye contact, her movements brisk, almost practiced. It was her. Undeniably her. Something inside me cracked, quietly, painfully. I left the shop in a fog, the truth settling into my bones like winter frost. On my way back to the house, I stopped to speak with Mrs. Green, our elderly neighbor who had known us since childhood. She stood at her doorway, wrapped in a knitted shawl. Your sister was carrying a little suitcase the morning after your mama passed, she told me. Looked heavy. She didn't say goodbye. Another piece of the puzzle. Another weight pressing on my chest. By the time I returned home, Lorna was in the living room, scrolling through her phone. I studied her, the tightness around her mouth, the composure she clung to like armor. She looked up, her gaze guarded. You look pale, she said. Everything okay? Her lie was smooth, practiced. Almost artful. But now I knew what lay beneath her calm facade, deception thick as poison. And as I stood there, receipt burning in my pocket, it struck me with chilling clarity, this wasn't just theft. It was betrayal. The kind that breaks families beyond repair. I didn't plan the confrontation. It rose out of me the way a storm breaks, sudden, inevitable, charged with a voltage built over years of things unsaid. By the time I stood in the living room doorway, the pawn receipt gripped tightly in my hand, something inside me had hardened. "Lorna," I said, my voice low. "We need to talk." She looked up from the couch, expression flat, neither alarmed nor surprised. "About what?" The casual tone made my heart pound harder. I stepped closer and placed the receipt on the coffee table between us. It landed with a soft sound, but its meaning was thunderous. She stared at it. Then at me. A long, unnerving silence separated those glances. "What is this?" she asked, though we both knew she recognized it instantly. "It's your signature," I said. "Your handwriting. The list of Mother's jewelry. The items you sold." Her jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near her temple. For a moment, I hoped she would crumble, apologize, explain, but she didn't. Instead, she let out a soft, humorless laugh. "So you went digging," she said, her voice shaped by disdain. "I figured you might." The coldness in her tone was worse than the crime itself. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would you take her things? Without telling me?" "Without even," my throat tightened. She wasn't even buried yet. Lorna rose slowly from the couch, her movements deliberate. "You wouldn't understand." "Help me understand," I pleaded. "Please." She walked to the window, stared out at the fading light. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, but there was something wild beneath it. "You were always her favorite," she said. "The one she trusted. The one she doted on. And I was, what? The spare. The background." She turned toward me. Her eyes weren't wet with grief, they were sharp with anger. "You think you're the only one who lost her?" "I never said that." "You didn't have to," she snapped. "She treated you like you were made of glass." "And me? I was the one who stayed with her those last months. I cleaned her, fed her, watched her fade while you visited when you could squeeze it in." "That's not fair," I whispered, stung. "Life's not fair," she said, shrugging. "I needed money. I was drowning. So, yes, I took the jewelry. I deserved something for the time I gave her." The air seemed to drain from the room. "You deserved compensation?" I repeated, horrified. "I deserved more than old stories and faded photos," she said coldly. "And I'm not giving anything back." I stared at her, feeling the final tether between us snap. There was no remorse in her voice. No shame. Only resentment carved sharp and deep across years of bitterness. "I didn't want this to become something darker," I said quietly. "But you've left me no choice." Her smile was razor thin. "Do what you want." I'm done trying to explain myself. And in that moment, I understood with chilling certainty, this wasn't a matter for sisters to resolve. This would be settled in a courtroom. The morning after the confrontation, I awoke with a heaviness that felt almost physical. It sat on my chest, pressing down like an unwelcome guest refusing to leave. Confronting Lorna had not brought clarity or reconciliation. It had peeled back something darker, revealing a wound that had been festering long before the theft. But grief could no longer disguise the truth. And the truth demanded action. The first attorney I met with sat behind a walnut desk, his fingers steepled thoughtfully as I explained the situation. He listened intently, his eyes narrowing not in judgment but in calculation. "You have evidence," he said when I finished. "Receipts, video footage, the neighbor's statement. This is more than sufficient to open a civil claim." The words made my stomach twist. Civil claim. Legal action. Against my own sister. "Once we begin," he added gently, "there's no going back." I knew that. Yet going back wasn't an option anymore. Over the next days, I moved through a fog of paperwork and procedure. I gathered documents, photographs of the original jewelry, appraisal records, bank statements that showed the items had been insured. Each piece of paper felt like a betrayal carved deeper, another reminder that Lorna had chosen secrecy and deceit over honesty, and I was now cataloging the remnants of her decision. At the pawn shop, the clerk reluctantly printed a detailed statement confirming everything he'd witnessed. As he slid the paper toward me, he avoided my eyes, as if he too felt the uncomfortable truth that theft is one thing, but theft within a family carries a stain time struggles to wash away. Your sister didn't look like she wanted trouble, he murmured. Just money. I swallowed hard. Sometimes wanting money becomes the trouble. Outside, the sky had darkened, swollen with storm clouds. The wind carried the metallic smell of impending rain, as if nature itself braced for the coming conflict. Every thunderous roll that followed felt like an omen. Days blurred as my attorney and I constructed the case, timelines, witness statements, copies of the pawn footage. I found myself studying the grainy image of Lorna again and again, her stiff posture, her tightly held purse, her downturned gaze. She didn't look desperate. She looked determined. That realization chilled me more deeply than anything else. Nights became the hardest. I would sit at the kitchen table, staring at my mother's handwriting on old recipe cards or the last letter she left me. She always believed families should protect each other, not fracture under the weight of grievances and unspoken resentments. If she could see us now, two daughters preparing to stand on opposite sides of a courtroom, what would she think? Would she blame me? Would she blame Lorna? Or would she simply weep for what had been lost long before the jewelry ever went missing? As the court date approached, the tension inside me tightened like a drawn bow. Every step forward felt heavy, slow, inevitable. The storm outside gathered strength. And I knew, whether I was ready or not, another, far more devastating storm was about to break inside that courtroom. The courthouse had always intimidated me. Its stone exterior, rigid and imposing, felt like it had been built not to welcome people, but to judge them. On the morning of the hearing, I stood outside its doors, feeling the chill seep through my coat, the sky above a stagnant gray that mirrored the heaviness in my chest. Inside, the courtroom was colder still, an echoing chamber of polished wood, faint murmurs, and the low hum of fluorescent lights. My attorney guided me to our table, his expression unreadable but steady, the kind of steady one needs when everything else threatens to unravel. Lorna was already there. She sat across the aisle, her posture small and deliberate, her eyes cast downward. She wore a conservative navy dress and minimal makeup, her appearance carefully curated to evoke sympathy. And for a fleeting moment, despite everything, I felt the sting of guilt. She looked fragile. But then she lifted her gaze and met mine, and what I saw there wasn't fragility. It was calculation. When the judge entered, the room snapped into silence. His presence was stern, commanding, the kind of authority that made even the innocent sit straighter. He reviewed the file briefly before nodding for the case to proceed. My attorney presented our evidence first. He moved with a quiet, precise confidence, starting with the appraisal documents, then the photographs of the jewelry, each image projected onto a small monitor. Next came the pawn receipts. The judge leaned forward slightly at those, reading them with slow concentration. Then came the footage. Grainy, black and white, but unmistakably clear enough to identify Lorna. The courtroom seemed to shrink as the video played. I watched her on screen as if watching a version of her I no longer recognized, eyes averted, shoulders tense, pushing the jewelry case across the counter with steady determination. Lorna's attorney objected, claiming stress, grief, financial pressure. He painted her as a woman overwhelmed, a caretaker pushed beyond her limits. He described her as the devoted daughter who had sacrificed more than I could ever understand. When Lorna took the stand, her voice trembled slightly, perfectly. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I was drowning after our mother died. I felt abandoned. I wasn't thinking clearly. Her performance was convincing. Almost enough that I wondered if I was the one who had misjudged her. Almost. But when my attorney questioned her about the timing, the secrecy, the receipts, her facade began to crack. She stumbled over her explanations, contradicted herself twice, then tried to backtrack. The judge watched her with steady, unblinking eyes that revealed nothing. Then came the neighbor's testimony. Mrs. Green shuffled to the stand, hands trembling slightly as she recalled seeing Lorna leaving our mother's house with a small case the morning after her death. It was a simple detail, but it slid into place like the final piece of a puzzle. By the time the expert appraisers confirmed the market value of the stolen items, the room felt suffocating. I stared at the judge's expressionless face, searching for some hint, some sign of his decision, but his features remained carved in stone. And then, with all evidence laid bare between us, the courtroom fell silent again. The verdict was moments away. The air felt sharper. Thicker. as if the entire room was holding its breath. The judge's voice sliced through the silence like a cold blade. Based on the evidence presented, the court rules in favor of the plaintiff. For a second, the air in the room seemed to still, no movement, no breath, only the quiet collapse of attention I had carried for too long. The judge continued, outlining the order. The jewelry was to be returned, or its monetary value paid in full. The pawn shop would release what remained. Damages were awarded. Legal fees compensated. It was justice. Clear, rational, unambiguous justice. But it didn't feel triumphant. Across the aisle, Lorna sat stiffly, her face drained of color. She didn't look at me. Not once. Her jaw clenched, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the courtroom wall. If she felt remorse, she hid it well. If she felt rage, she buried it beneath the same practiced composure that had masked her lies. When the judge dismissed us, chairs scraped, papers shuffled, murmurs rose. But I remained seated for a moment, unable to move. The verdict had settled the legal wrong, but the emotional devastation sprawled far beyond the limits of the courtroom. Outside, the sky was still gray, but the storm had passed. Puddles dotted the concrete steps, and the air carried that faint metallic scent only rain leaves behind. My attorney shook my hand, offered quiet congratulations, but his voice felt distant. Hollow. Every step toward the parking lot felt heavier. Justice, I realized, was not the same as healing. Justice restores property, not relationships. Justice repairs losses, not trust. As I reached my car, I glanced back at the courthouse. Lorna stood near the entrance, speaking to her attorney, her shoulders rigid. For a brief moment, her eyes lifted and met mine. There was no apology in them. No softness. Only a simmering resentment, like embers that refused to die out. Then she turned away. I drove home slowly, letting the repetition of the road steady me. Inside my mother's empty house, the silence pressed in once more. But it felt different now, less like a warning, more like an echo. The safe in her closet still sat slightly crooked. I opened it gently, half expecting to find only emptiness again. Instead, the pawnshop sealed envelope sat inside, holding the pieces recovered. Some were missing forever, sold, melted down, lost to strangers. Others were scratched or tarnished from their brief stay in the hands of those who saw only dollar signs. I laid the remaining pieces on my mother's dresser. The locket. The silver bracelet. The brooch she cherished. They would never shine the same way again, but they were back where they belonged. A strange, quiet sorrow moved through me. This wasn't the ending she would have wanted for her daughters. As twilight crept in through the windows, the house seemed to exhale a long, weary breath. I sat on the edge of her bed, letting memories wash over me. Grief, betrayal, justice, and something colder, something I didn't want to name. Because the truth is this, when a stranger steals from you, it wounds. But when a sister betrays you, it scars. Deeply. Permanently. And yet, in that somber room, surrounded by the remnants of a life now gone, I felt a small flicker of peace. A dark, imperfect peace, but peace nonetheless. Justice had been served. The story was over. But some endings, I realized, are not meant to be clean. Some linger, quiet and heavy, long after the verdict is read.